So, over to William Casey, I'll get it right this time, thank you, who is well known to us locally, a great historian, and he goes into a great amount of detail. Native of the Skibbereen area, we've heard him talking about children's burial grounds, amongst other things, but his latest research, completed in 2016, I think, is a thesis on the early Fenian movement in the Skibbereen region. And this is what he's going to talk to us about. So thank you, William.
Good afternoon, folks. My name, as Robert said, is William Casey, and I'm going to be talking to you this morning about the Fenians, and particularly the early Fenians in Skibbereen. And I suppose this weekend there's been a lot of talk in other sessions about the War of Revolution and the fallout from that, etc. And it's no harm to go back and maybe look at the genesis of some of what happened there, which was very much the Fenian movement. And also this year is the 150th anniversary of the Fenian Rising, so it is an opportune time to look at who the Fenians were, and particularly the early Fenian movement. And Skibbereen was known as the cradle of Fenianism. It was very important to the early Fenian movement. So again, my talk is looking at that early period from the mid-1850s up to just before the Rising, probably the mid-1860s, and see why did Skibbereen get that title, the cradle of Fenianism. So what I'll cover is very quickly an introduction to who the Fenians were, in case anyone doesn't know. Then I will look at the early Fenian movement, or slightly before it, the Phoenix National Literary Society, which was a society here in Skibbereen before the Fenian movement. Then I will look at early Fenianism in Skibbereen, quickly look at its later influences, and always be conscious of why was Skibbereen the cradle of Fenianism. So just to say that the Fenians, who were of course a revolutionary movement dedicated to getting Ireland's freedom through an armed insurrection, they didn't arrive just out of nowhere. There was a history, there was a tradition behind them that they built on. And it really goes back to the 1700s. The Irish Volunteers were a militia. They were a militia. But at the time of the American War of Independence, the British had to move the regular army out. They left the militia in charge. And a lot of them were Protestants, or at least led by Protestants, but they took this opportunity to gain freedoms for Ireland, particularly in areas of extended powers with Irish Parliament and free trade. And they used, basically, they were inside College Green in Dublin, and on their cannons there was free trade, or this. And this idea of Britain being in trouble and threatening them with force. They never used force, they just threatened it. But that was something that lived on in the Irish mind, that this is a way to get concessions from Britain. Also during the 1700s there were a lot of agrarian societies, secret societies, that kind of worked generally against landlordism. They usually had no political agenda, but again this idea of having secret societies that conducted violence was prevalent in the 1700s. And in this area there was an outbreak of that in the 1780s with the Wright Boys. Later on in the 1790s we have the United Irishmen, who are the first kind of republicans in Ireland, who were inspired by the French Revolution, Wolfe Tone, later on Robert Emmet. After that you had the Active Union, Daniel O'Connell, who kind of rejected violence and wished to move things forward through peaceful means. Early on he was supported by a group of young nationalists called the Young Islanders, but later in the 1840s they split from him for a number of reasons, but one of the core reasons was that O'Connell was against the use of violence in any circumstances. They felt there were times where it was legitimate to use violence, but they didn't advocate a violent revolution. It was something, if the opportunity arose, we might do it. In 1848, circumstances arose where they were kind of cornered into having a rebellion that didn't last very long. Really was just a skirmish in Ballingarry and Tipperary. It was all over in an afternoon. But again, their ideals were very important, if not their methods, certainly their ideals were very important to the later Fenian movement. And some of the leaders of the Fenians started out as Young Irelanders, as I show later on. In the 1850s, there was a real, I suppose, vacuum in Irish politics. O'Connell was dead, Young Irelanders were dispersed in exile or dead. Constitutional politics did try to regroup in the early 1850s with the Irish Independence Party, Sadler and Keogh and people like that, and that very quickly fizzled out. So there was a vacuum which the Fenians filled to some extent. And other developments at the time which were very important to the Fenians were it was the national school system that came in the 1830s. So this was the first generation of Irish people who were literate, and they had a huge curiosity about the world about them, and that was very important to the movement. And of course, nothing in 19th century or later 19th century Ireland can be seen without taking into consideration the Great Famine and the effects that that had, and fears that people had of another famine reoccurring, and the belief that if that did reoccur, we would not kind of, as I say, it's just quoting Dylan Thomas, we would not go gently into that good night. This time we would fight. There wouldn't, that was very prevalent throughout the later decades of the 19th century. So quickly, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, who were the official name of the Fenians, founded by this man, James Stephens, native of Kilkenny, quite an enigma. In one way, is a great leader, tirelessly working, but also a man who dillied and dallied and couldn't make up his mind, and was eventually overthrown as leader. He was initially a Young Irelander, was at Ballingarry, was injured there, put it out that he was killed there. They had a mock funeral for him and everything, so he actually escaped to Paris, where he met up with another Young Ireland leader, John O'Mahony, who came from what we call the Tri-County area up around Mitchelstown, Tipperary, Limerick. There's this bit of dispute about where he was born, but the O'Mahonys actually were quite large landowners, even though there were Catholics up in that area. O'Mahony was a well-known Irish scholar as well, and he and Stephens were in Paris together after the failed Young Ireland rebellion, but in the early 1850s O'Mahony moved on to America to try to organise Irish America to give support to Ireland. Eventually Stephens came back to Ireland, and with the promise of support from America, in 1858 he formed the IRB. It was a secret oath-bound society. Nobody was supposed to know this existed. Even initially it didn't have a name, it was that secret. And it was built on a cell structure, 9 members in a cell that elected a sergeant, and 9 sergeants elected a captain, and the 9 captains had a colonel. And that was to stop infiltration and information getting out, and you were only supposed to know the members of your own cell. But think about it, you're trying to organise a revolution, you're trying to train troops. How do you train troops if nobody knows 9, 10? So from very early on, it was a wonderful theory, but from very early on that structure never really worked. So what did the IRB want? They wanted an independent Irish Republic, achieved through force of arms, because they believed no other method would gain them that republic. The republic was very much based on the American ideals of a republic. It was supposed to have universal suffrage, but at the time that meant universal male suffrage. They had no plans for female suffrage. They were very strong on this idea of the separation of church and state. That was one of the things that they were consistent throughout Otherwise than that, they had really had no platform what a united or what an independent Ireland would look like. They had no set down social, economic or cultural programme, and part of that was if you start kind of saying, you know, we're for or against, to use a modern term, water charges, then you're certainly getting into the nitty-gritty of politics. So, you know, they had this one big idea, independent Ireland. Afterwards we'll sort out everything else. After the IRB was founded in Patrick's Day, 1858, Stevens and his right-hand man, this guy, Thomas Clark Luby, started off on a recruitment tour around Ireland. Stevens eventually came to Bandon. He was given a letter of introduction to a gentleman from Skibbereen called Daniel McCarthy, and we'll be talking quite a lot about these men in a minute. He swore McCarthy into the new IRB. It was a note-bound society. McCarthy then swore in a gentleman by the name of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa and Mortimer Moynihan. They in turn swore in Patrick Downing and others. And from then there was an explosion of Fenianism out of Skibbereen. This was a jihad of Fenianism. Skibbereen was the centre. So just why did that happen? Why was Skibbereen so important? Some of it was its location and its importance locally. It was the capital of the Carberries. It was an administrative centre, the centre of a poor law union. It was the seat of the Bishop of Ross. Later on, from the late 1850s, it was quite unique in Ireland in that it had its own newspaper. So Skibbereen punched above its weight because of all these reasons. It was also kind of known as a political centre. O'Connell in 1843 had a mass rally here. It was quoted at the time that 500,000 people attended that rally. That's undoubtedly a huge exaggeration. But at the same time, probably a couple of 100,000 maybe did. And at the time, the population of Skibbereen Union was 100,000 people. It had, like many other towns, an emerging nationalist, middle-class Catholic who had given their support to the Young Ireland movement. Names like Timothy McCarthy Downing, who was a solicitor originally from Kinmare, Daniel McCarthy Sr., Jeremiah Conlan Sr., who were involved in the Confederate Club, which were set up by the Young Ireland movement in Skibbereen. And again, it's a show of support of the Young Irelanders was that when the Young Ireland leader, William Smith O'Brien, was imprisoned, there was a petition for his release. 80,000 signatures was collected for that throughout Ireland. There was 120 of those from Skibbereen, which in one way is significant, but out of 80,000 it's not a huge amount. And the reason, of course, was 1848, Skibbereen was in the throes of the Great Famine and very much in the epicentre of that terrible event. So the people of Skibbereen had other things in their mind than the freedom of William Smith O'Brien. So significant in one sense who signed it and that there was a petition here, but not huge amount of numbers because Skibbereen was in the midst of this awful, dreadful event, the Great Famine. So after the famine, Skibbereen, like many other towns, gradually, I suppose, developed in the 1850s were a time of economic progress. There was, as I mentioned, the attempt at the Independent Irish Party. There was a liberal club set up in Skibbereen to support that. There were also associations in the town for looking for tenant rights. There were things that in the 1850s, the Crimea War occurred. That actually got cross community support from Skibbereen. And that has shown that in 1856, when Major Somerville of Castle Townsend came back from the Crimea. He was greeted as a hero in Skibbereen. There was a reception for him in the national school, the Catholic school, and attended across parties. Indeed, one Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa wrote a little ditty about it at the time. So this was, at the time, there was there was inter-community support for popular causes in Skibbereen, and the Crimea War was a popular cause, even among nationalists. However, there also was this new generation emerging who had lived through the famine, had been born just before the famine in the 1830s, had been educated, and they were, I suppose, like all young men, trying to do new things and think new ideas, and they were moving away from some of the more older established figures like Timothy McCarthy Downing to new ideas. And some of the names in those, of course, the best known was Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, a native of Rosscarbery, whose father died during the famine. His family immigrated. He moved towards Skibbereen to be with cousins. He ended up living with the Downings, who were cousins with him, of his in Skibbereen. He was a merchant here in the town. Again, quite well educated, very well read. Daniel McCarthy Jr. in this case, and the strange spelling of Carthy was because both Daniel Sr. and Jr. worked for McCarthy with the normal spelling, McCarthy Breweries here in Skibbereen. They were the managers of the foreman and that, and it seems they changed their name to avoid confusions between the owner and the manager. Mortimer Moynihan, and there's a nice article, I hope anyway, in the journal issue that I wrote about Mortimer Moynihan that I hope you'll find interesting. He was from Macroom. Came to Skibbereen in 1856. He had been a school teacher, had been dismissed from his position, came to Skibbereen as a law clerk in McCarthy Downing's firm, and really became the workhorse in the early years of the movement. The Downing brothers, Patrick and Dennis, who were cousins of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, there were other people as well that were involved. Jory Crowley, who was quite a little bit older, a pharmacist, as we call him today, in Skibbereen, had been very active during the famine. His nephew, Daniel O'Crowley, was involved. There was a Patrick Carey, a clerk. So these are a group generally of young men who were interested in new ideas, were interested in nationalism and culture. Some of them, like O'Donovan Ross and McCarthy and Moynihan, were members of the Oceanic Society, which was a society at the time set up to preserve Irish language and culture. And they decided to come together to form their own society, the Phoenix National and Literary Society. And it was formed sometime in late 56, early 57. It was dominated by these men that I spoke about. One of the things that there's been a bit of debate about where they got the name. It was always said, O'Donovan Ross has said that he came up with the name. Some recent historians have kind of said, there were societies in America called the Phoenix Society, and they seem to base this on one particular newspaper article. I did quite an extensive search for a Phoenix Society in America predating this. I didn't find any. And I think the source that many of them quote as he misunderstood what was happening. From what I can see, Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa came up with the name Phoenix on his own accord. And that was a name then that was carried out from Skibbereen. The Phoenix Society was a book and debating club which promoted the national cause. It wasn't unique. Debating clubs and book clubs like this were actually quite popular in the 1850s, often promoted by the temperance movement as a way of keeping young men out of pubs. There were other national ones, or national-minded ones, like the National Reading Rooms in Turkey Street in Cork. So it wasn't unique. A you've come across a lot of stuff, particularly in the web, saying it was a military organisation and it was a prototype of Phoenixism. The Phoenix Society was none of those things. It was a literary debating society. One thing it did stand out and one thing we know a lot about it, because they were very good at publicising what they were about. And they published their manifesto or preamble, and it tells us what they wanted to achieve. And it was to advocate and assert our rights as a distinct national existence, to make the peasantry in our own locality at least, understand that for them exists but one country which they are bound to love and cherish and defend, and make them understand their rights as men to combat against the widely spread and corrupt leprosy of imperialism, and to foster and rouse the action of the latent spirit of nationality, are the first and immediate objects of the society. So set out what they want to do. How were they going to do it? They were going to place within the reach of the members of society a national literature of the purest and best description to afford them every useful information connected with the past and the knowledge of what they are justly entitled to in the future. So they weren't putting guns in their hands, they were putting books in their hands. And the preamble went on to say, this organisation spoke about must be understood to mean not, and that's the original italics put in by them, not by me, a system of military tactics. However, the members would be prepared for the day when England was paralysed by war, and then they would be ready to act as one man. Again, harking back to the Irish volunteers, that England's difficulty would be Ireland's opportunity, and that is the occasion where we might use force. Accompanying the preamble was a letter from Mortimer Moynihan that goes on to say that they were trying to explain, I suppose, why they were seeking all this publicity, that they wished to set up an organisation like this in every town and village in Ireland, and the society would be thoroughly democratic in its tone and would be careful to exclude all unworthy characters. So, yeah. No riff-raff, please. We are a very serious group of people thinking about Ireland's future, and again, professing Young Ireland politics. So, we have a good idea what they wanted to do. So its membership. O'Donovan Rossell later claimed that it had about 100 members, and I think that was probably at its greatest extent. Mortimer Moynihan, in a letter in 1859, in late 1857, said that they had started out with 9 members, and by the end of 1857 they had about 60 members. One meeting that we know of in September 1857, 56 members attended. So, about 100 members at its max. It never grew bigger than that. It initially met in Jerry Crowley's apothecary's shop or pharmacy in North Street, Skibbereen. Crowley, however, died in January 1857. So they moved to a public house in Mortimer Downing, he was called Mortimer Downing II, because O'Donovan and Ross's cousin, Ellen Barry, was married to Mortimer Downing I, as you might call him, who was from Kinmare. This Mortimer Downing was also from Kinmare, but from I can see not related to the other Mortimer Downing, had come into Skibbereen separately and had a public house in Main Street in Skibbereen. Often a lot of confusion between the two Mortimer Downings, and indeed some people get confused in with the Mortimer Moynihan as well. A letter then in 1859 written by Mortimer Moynihan and Daniel McCarthy stated that by early 1858 the society was in serious decline and only a few members remained. So why did it go into decline so quickly? And it was in a way a victim of its own success at publicising what it was about. So June 1857, the Indian Mutiny occurred. The society took a position on that which was quite reasonable for them, an anti-imperialist one that condemned British imperialism and said, we cannot forget that India properly belongs to the Indians, and we doubt that any Irishman will assert a claim over it. It was, from their point of view, that was very logical. It wasn't a popular one. Again, popular opinion was very much on the side of the British at the time. Later on, in January 1858, early January, O'Donovan Rossa gave a speech to the first anniversary dinner of the Society, and he spent a lot of time talking about the Irish volunteers. And one of the things he said, England has never given us anything through love of us, or love of justice. She has ever spurned our petitions when they are not backed by the sword. So again, getting a bit more radical, talking more on military terms. But these were not popular ideas at the time. And one of the first indications we have of that was Mortimer Downing actually writing to the Dublin Castle in February of 1858, asking if it was okay to allow these people let the room in his house after hours, and the observation that came back from the local superintendent here in Skibbereen was that this was a disaffected political society. Of course, what really happened was the employers, because these were all young men, they were generally clerks, they were just young men starting out in life. The employers got very, what's happening here? Do we want this happening in our town? And the kind of more established employer class basically put it up to these guys. You have a choice. You can continue on in your employment, or you can continue on as a member of the Phoenix Society. And that's why in early 1858 they had just a few members remaining. That, of course, all changed with the arrival of Stevens into Skibbereen. As I said, Rossa, Moynihan, McCarthy, the Downings very quickly were sworn in. The other members of the Phoenix Society, 90% of them, we are told, became members of the IRB. And this new IRB, I suppose, it gave them a structure, it gave them a new purpose, it was kind of very clear what they wanted. And also, this, because it was a secret organisation, oath-bound, it gave them security against being fired or anything. They'd say, oh, I'm not a member at all. This society sure doesn't exist. So very quickly, the members of the Phoenix Society joined the IRB, by and large. And then there was an explosion out of Skibbereen, carried mainly by the three men, Rossa, Moynihan and McCarthy. Moynihan, as I mentioned, was a clerk in Timothy McCarthy Downing's firm, so he worked a lot in West Cork, into South Kerry. He carried Fenianism with him, particularly into Kenmare. Daniel McCarthy, was instrumental in taking it into Bantry, to such an extent that eventually the parish priest of Bantry had him excluded from the town. Rossa worked more in the parishes immediately around Skibbereen and tried to move it east along into Clonakilty. Initially not that successful, but later on Clonakilty also became quite a hotbed of Fenianism. So from Skibbereen, this movement moved out very quickly, and in late 1858 the police found what they thought was a notebook of one of these leaders, and it stated there was 182 members in Kenmare, 218 in Bantry, and 876 members in Skibbereen. Within a few months, very quickly, this explosion. As quickly as it developed, the church and the state also reacted very quickly. The church, of course, were very much against Fenianism. They didn't like the idea of the republic, they didn't like the idea of the separation of church and state. They condemned membership of any secret society, not just the oath-bound secret society, not just the Fenianism. So on a number of levels, the church And the first condemnation of the Fenians I was able to come across was in Cora parish to the north of here. The parish priest there at the time was Father Dorr, had been parish priest there for over 50 years, and he stood up in September of 1858 at a sermon and said any member of this new society would be excommunicated. And he also said it would be folly to join this because the Queen's power is too strong and you would be put down. Very quickly, other local priests condemned them. The parish priest of Bantry moved against them fairly quickly. The parish priest of Kinmare actually wrote to Dublin Castle about them. Again, afterwards, the Bishop of Kerry, Bishop Moynihan, was staunchly against the Fenians. The local bishop here in Skibbereen, Bishop O'Hay, was also a severe opponent of the Fenians. Very quickly, Constabulary here started to gather information on them, and one of the things that surprised me that within a couple of months they knew everything about the cell structure. There was a cell out in Roaring Water in Halfadown Parish with 7 members, and it said it only needs 2 more to appoint a captain. So they knew about the cell structure within weeks. They started tracking things like pipe making. They knew drilling was going on. They started gathering all this information, but they didn't have enough to actually act against them. So they brought in this guy, George Fitzmaurice, who had been an Irish Constabulary officer, had then become a magistrate, and he'd worked mainly in Armagh and Louth against the agrarian societies, the ribbonmen up there. So he had experience of working against secret societies. They transferred him to Skibbereen. He made a couple of blunders, but eventually he did put, I suppose, focus on the investigation in Skibbereen. And at the same time, they resorted to one of their oldest tricks in the book, was to get an informer within the organisation. And the informer who they bought and paid for really was Daniel O'Sullivan Gowla. He came from near Kinmare. He was a process server, so he came to Skibbereen on the pretense of looking for work from McCarthy Downing's firm. Mortimer Downing was from Kinmare, so he actually stayed in Mortimer Downing's pub in Main Street, gathered all the information. So they had, by December 1858, they had all the information they required, and they arrested a large number of people in Skibbereen, other arrests in Bantry and Kerry. They're the 12 that were arrested in Skibbereen: Mortimer Downing, Rossa, Moynihan and the Downings. Just to show in graphic form that Skibbereen, there was 12 in Skibbereen, followed by Kinmare 9, and a few others in Killarney and Bantry, but Skibbereen was the largest number of arrests at the time. So what happened afterwards? The leaders spent several months in jail. A lot of in Skibbereen, half of them were released on bail on Christmas Eve, 1858. Eventually, charges were brought against 5 of the defendants in Kerry, but only 1 was convicted. Another, Daniel O'Sullivan agreeing at this. And in Cork, charges were eventually brought against 7 in July of 1859. At that stage, only 3 remained in jail: O'Donovan Rossa, William O'Shea of Bantry, and Mortimer Moynihan. Their private lives at this stage were pretty much in disarray. They had lost their... Rossa says how his business had gone downhill. His wife, he had a wife and 4 children. They were thrown out of their house and had to find new accommodation. The Fenians wanted them to fight on. They sent word to fight on, but it never got to them. So they thought the whole IRB thing was dead. They were it's caught in a situation. So there was a new Liberal government in the summer of 1859. A deal was proposed: plead guilty, pledge to good behaviour in the future, you'll be released immediately. Daniel O'Sullivan agreeing would be released as well. So they pleaded guilty, they were released. O'Sullivan wasn't immediately released, but he was released later in October. Although this was happening, James Stephens was in America. He had left in October 1858, where he founded the Fenian Brotherhood. He brought together the various organisations there and founded the Fenian Brotherhood, which gave the Fenian movement its name because, unlike the RB, it was an open movement. You didn't take a secret oath, you took a pledge, but it was an open pledge, and it publicised what it was doing. So very quickly, this organisation became known as the Fenians. However, after that, after the Phoenix arrests here in Skibbereen, Stephens feared if he came back to Ireland, he would also be arrested, so he went to Paris. And Derby appeared really to be done and dusted. One thing that did happen, of course, was the name, the Phoenix Society and Skibbereen became linked in the public imagination to Fenianism. However, it wasn't all quite over. Once they were released from jail, Daniel McCarthy and Patrick Downing travelled to Paris to update Stephens what was happening. And again, like Pat earlier, this, it was much more to and fro than we think. As McCarthy went on to have a tour of the cities in the east of America to spread the word, and then he came back via Paris to Skibbereen. Downing went to Paris, went to New York, and stayed there. He became a close associate with John O'Mahony, who had at this stage founded the Phoenix newspaper, taken from the Skibbereen Phoenix Society, the name. And also at the time, there was a group of politicians in America known as the Know Nothing parties that had basically stopped Irish people joining local militias. So the Fenians got around that by forming their own kind of independent militias to carry out military training, and they became known as the Phoenix Brigade. And Patrick Downing became associated with them, as did another Skibbereen man, Francis Weltby, who had been born here in Skibbereen, basically where the post office is now, and had immigrated a number of years earlier. O'Donovan, Ross and Moynihan attempted to restart their lives. It was quite difficult. O'Donovan Ross's, not only was his livelihood disrupted, but his first wife, Nora or Nan Ager, died on the 1st of November 1858, and he firmly put the blame on that, on his imprisonment. Mortimer Moynihan originally left Skibbereen, went to Cork, but came back within a few months to get married here. Mortimer Downing II was also ruined, and in 1859 he died suddenly. And in the appeal for his widow, it mentioned how he had been left with huge debts, which he struggled to overcome. Just a suggestion that he might have actually committed suicide because of the pressure of that. So these guys were trying to put their lives back together. And at the time, there were a series of very poor harvests in Ireland from 1859 into 1863. There was a lot of distress in this area. O'Donovan Rossa, for a while, actually was an officer for Cape Clear and Sherkin for distributing food, but he actually lost his job for distributing too many rations. When all seemed kind of lost, John O'Mahony came and visited Ireland, and one of the things he did was he visited Skibbereen, and he met McCarthy, Moynihan and Rossa, and this seemed to inspire him, and he then forced Stephens to come back to Ireland. He basically told Stephens, come back or we will replace you. So Stephens came back. And one of the first things that Stephens did when he came back again was visit Skibbereen. Because Skibbereen was the heart of Fenians at the time. And as John O'Leary later said, he met the inevitable Rossa, Moynihan and McCarthy, the three men at the time. Stephens then set about getting rid of the opposition, particularly the constitutional nationalists, and he used a number of ways to do that. The most famous was the funeral of Terence Bellew McManus, an old young Irelander who had died in San Francisco, they brought back his body and had a big funeral, again echoes of what happened later with O'Donovan Rossa. And Rossa was one of the people involved in organising that, and Francis Weltby was one of the Guard of Honours that was sent over with his body. So after those events, Stephen's back, series of bad harvests, there was a rapid growth of IRB throughout Ireland this time. Locally, at this stage, Rossa becomes the primary leader, though Moynihan and McCarthy are still involved. And Skibbereen is quite different to other areas because they never quite got the idea that this was a secret organisation in Skibbereen. So they also organised things like marches, like the most famous one was the march in support of the Polish rebels. Now, if you're a secret organisation, marching to Skibbereen isn't what you're supposed to be doing. There was another one in Union Hall a month later. This was not always appreciated by the IRB leadership, who later commented, "We think at times the nationalists in Skibbereen are rather too demonstrative." So they were, "God lads, keep it quiet, keep it underground," but no, Skibbereen was different. It brought about much more renewed scrutiny of the local organisation. As a result, one of the early leaders, John O'Driscoll, who was a school teacher, was dismissed from his post. O'Donovan Rossa left Skibbereen in May 1863. At this stage he had remarried, his second wife had just had a child, and basically he was going over to America to find work and to bring them over. However, it didn't work out that way because his second wife, Ellen Buckley, who was from Castlehaven, just off the road here, died in July 1863. So Rossa came back. And it coincided with a kind of a strange decision for a secret organisation. They set up their own newspaper, the Irish People. So O'Donovan Rossa was made the general manager of the Irish People, which meant he travelled all over Ireland trying to sell the newspaper. He also was the biggest recruiter of IRB members. That was, he was officially travelling to sell the newspaper, but in reality, a big part of his job was organising the IRB around the country. Daniel Downing, the younger brother of Patrick and Dennis Downing, and Michael Moynihan, the younger brother of Mortimer Moynihan, became clerks in the Irish newspaper. Mortimer Moynihan organised a loan from Skibbereen and Rosscarbery, Maine, one I'm quite sure was never repaid, to set up the Irish newspaper, and he sold the newspaper locally and he contributed to the newspaper, articles in the newspaper. One of the things that happened, kind of the influence of Skibbereen, was that one evening Daniel Downing and the great IRB leader John Devine were out walking in the Phoenix Park. They met two men from Skibbereen, and at the time there was a big debate in the IRB, should they recruit among the British Army. These two guys had actually joined the British Army and they started recruiting for the IRB. And they told Devine this, and that gave Devine the kind of the ammunition he needed to go back to the Central Council and see and said, this can work. And afterwards, there was a big recruitment drive at IRB within the British Army. A chance meeting between Downing, Devine and the two Skibbereen men helped that. Also, the American Civil War had started. Fenians initially were kind of, we don't know what to do about this, but eventually they said, look, we'll join, we'll get military experience. Also, it was a way of recruiting young men through the military. So they eventually joined the army on both sides, but mainly on the Union side in great numbers. The Downing brothers, Patrick and Dennis, joined. Francis Weltby died. Dennis Downing lost a foot in the Battle of Gettysburg. Francis Weltby did not survive the Civil War. While all this was happening, Rossa, of course, had left Skibbereen, so there was the new leader of the organisation Skibbereen was a man called Cornelius Dwyer Keane. He, again, was a great organiser and got a lot of people in, particularly towards Clonakilty and that. But he was arrested in December 1846 while trying to recruit members in a pub in Rah, probably the Shibeen pub. And one of the extraordinary events in Skibbereen happened after that, because there was a belief that the local parish priest had actually tipped off the constabulary of what Cornelius Dwyer Keane was doing. And effigy burning was quite common at the time. But a group gathered in Market Street in Skibbereen and burned Father Collins in effigy. It was unheard of to burn a priest in effigy. This news actually went right around the world. It was condemned from on high on every angle. Newspapers that were normally sympathetic to the Fenians condemned it. The only people who actually supported it were the Irish People newspaper, the Fenians' own newspaper. So Skibbereen was still being discussed, still at the heart of the Fenianism at that stage. 1865, the Civil War ends, veterans start coming back. Timothy Deasy from Clonakilty would have come to Skibbereen. Michael O'Regan of Rosscarbery would have come back and would have gone to Glenmire. Captain Eugene O'Sullivan, who was a Skibbereen man, came back here. The authorities got very worried when they saw these Yanks, who a lot of them stood out because they came back with their fancy clothes and their strange accents, and they said, oh, something's about to happen. And they'd been keeping a close eye on the Irish People newspaper. So in September 1865, they raided the paper. O'Donovan Rossa was arrested. Martin Moynihan, who happened just to be in Dublin visiting his brother, who was a clerk there, was arrested in thinking that they had arrested his brother. It was the wrong man they got. Cornelius Dwyer Keane was there. He claimed to be trying to put together his defence for the charge in Rah. He was arrested. And at the same time, the British government moved against the recruits in the British Army. They started moving against the Fenians in every level. And in February 1868, habeas corpus was suspended, and there were numerous arrests in Skibbereen, mainly among the officer class of the Fenians, but also some rank and file. And again, just to show the difference of Skibbereen still at that time, at this stage, the movement had spread far and wide, but the largest number in Cork were in the city, 54, but after that, Skibbereen, Poor Law Union at 19, was the biggest number of arrests anywhere in Cork. So Skibbereen was still very important to the Fenian movement in 1866. One of the groups that were arrested were a group of young men in Haffadown, and the youngest of those his prison record said he was 17, he actually was 18. And this is a picture of him and his colleagues being taken into Cork jail. His name was William Casey. He was my great-grandfather. So somewhere in there is the bold William Casey. After the arrest, the Fenian movement is kind of in chaos, really. Much of the leadership are in exile or in jail. Martin Moynihan is quickly released. They realise they're the wrong man, and he actually becomes quite a significant leader in Cork and later in the national organisation. A rising, which was supposed to happen in 1856, was postponed twice. In America, the Fenian movement splits between those who want to invade Canada and those who want to send aid to Ireland. Stephen goes over to America to try and bring it all together. He fails miserably and is deposed as leader. This man, Thomas Kelly, takes over. At the time, Martin Moynihan has arrived in America. He's become an important lieutenant to Stevens. Because Kelly wants to come to Ireland to organise a rebellion, Martin Moynihan is made interim leader of the Fenian Brotherhood in America. So a man who's cut his teeth here in Skibbereen is now the leader of the Fenian Brotherhood in America, and he's largely forgotten, unfortunately. Kelly goes on to Europe to organise the rising, which eventually happens on the 5th of March 1867. I'm not going to go into it, it's a whole other talk. It's a disaster. It really fizzles out within a couple of days. The main insurrection is in Dublin. There are incidents in Munster and Clare and Limerick and Tipperary. There is a bit of incidents in Cork City and in East Cork. West Cork, the heart of it all. What happens? Absolutely nothing. At that stage, all the leaders had been imprisoned. The government has flooded it with army, with reserve constables. They had locked down. They'd even shut the pubs early, which is unforgivable, just because there's a rebellion coming. Nothing happened in Skibbereen, the heartland of Fenianism, or anywhere in West Cork. Immediately afterwards, there was very little public support for the Fenians. But again, in echoes of what happened in 1916, November 1867, the Manchester martyrs were hanged. Public opinion changed. Certainly, maybe people didn't become sympathetic towards the ideals of Fenianism, but certainly they became sympathetic towards Fenians and Fenian prisoners in particular. There were mock funerals held throughout Ireland, including quite a big one here in Skibbereen. Public opinion changed, as I said, and at that time, the term Skibbereen, the cradle of Fenianism, was first used, first kind, by the Skibbereen Eagle newspaper, and has stuck ever since. Afterwards, O'Donovan Rossa, he is not a model prisoner, by the way. He does everything in his power to annoy the authorities, and he becomes one of the figureheads of the Fenian prisoners. And he actually is elected MP for Tipperary, which is quite extraordinary. I mean, I think at the time it was a very restrictive franchise. You know, it wasn't universal suffrage by any means, but Rossa still managed to get elected. In the 1870s and 1880s, new political movements and cultural movements, the Land League, the Irish Home Rule Party, GA, Conradh Gaeilge, all these explode later. And when you look at them, you look back at many of the people involved were originally Fenians. This is where they cut their teeth. This is where they became politicised. Even though many of them moved away from the idea of Fenianism, this was their cradle, Fenianism. Most of the Skibbereen leaders died quite young in exile. Cornelius de Kane was transported to Australia. He died there in the early 1880s. His wife and children never left Skibbereen. They were never reunited. Dennis Downing, who lost his foot at Gettysburg, got TB, tuberculosis. He came back here and died in Skibbereen in 1871. A few years later, Patrick Downing also succumbed to tuberculosis. Martin Moynihan had a rather sad ending, really. He had mental health issues. He died in Cork Lunatic Asylum in 1881. So none of these guys became rich or famous or anything because of their involvement. They sacrificed quite a lot for what they did. Well, in terms of longevity anyway, the exception was Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa, who lived to become an old man. He died in 1915, and his funeral was an important milestone in what happened in Easter 1916. So again, some 60 years after the founding of the Phoenix Society, Skibbereen was playing a role in what happened in Easter 1916. So that's my talk, and I'm open to any questions.
Well, a wonderful, very considered story, I think. I think we would have gained a lot from that. Yes.
Yes, William, I'd like to compliment you on your excellent talk and your comprehensive review of the Fenian movement.
Thanks.
It's quite complicated actually. And if you look at the textbook for Get Bits in here, which you brought all together, and I had owned that, which you had published an excellent article in the Journal of Discovery and Historic Society, which was launched yesterday on Mortimer Downey, or Mortimer Moynihan, to get a comprehensive review of him. The question, anyone who hasn't read that, their education is a small country. It's available now in all bookshops and libraries. And there's also another article about the figures.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
But the question I want to ask you is this. They were involved, those people were involved in the Oceanic Society. But one of the founders of the Oceanic Society was a Skibbereen at the same time, and that was Calvin Goodman.
Yeah.
And he was a Chitwala minister in Skibbereen, quite an extraordinary man. He was a native Irish speaker. He was a collector of music, and he was a professor of Irish in Trinity. And he was one of the founders of it. And they published 6 files of transactions of the Organic Society, which are available in the 2 various ones in the Blue Library report. And it gives an insight into the thinking of that particular time. But in my research in Calvin Goodman, I never found any contact that any of those people could read. When you came out from the other side, I would if you find any connection between the two. It's really a pity, you know. I think that he was a Church of Ireland clergyman, very significant to Ireland, native Irish speaker, professor of Irish, and Irish culture. On the other hand, you had these people communicating. I just wonder if the two together, if the religious divide was to grow, if we put it together, and some night people over the pints, it could settle down the different.
Yeah, the Oceanic Society attracted a broad range of people. The Reverend Fisher Kilmore was another member. Again, he was a renowned scholar, but also quite a controversial figure during the famine. I think it's one of the things that, that the Fenians were not a sectarian organisation, and they prided themselves in not being a sectarian organisation. That they really were devoted to this idea of the separation of church and state. They didn't care whether you were Catholic, Protestant or dissenter. And I think that's, and the Oceanic Society, again, was not a political situation. It was purely a cultural society. It had no political agenda whatsoever. When I saw the names, I wondered, did they ever meet? What are the local meetings of the Oceanic Society? And if they did, what was discussed? But I couldn't find any record other than that they were all members at the same time, that there was any interaction with them at a local level. But it is a fascinating idea. Did these people who came from very different political and religious viewpoints, but had this common interest in Irish culture and language, did they meet? Did they intermingle? I can't say one way or the other if they did.
Okay, one question at the back first.
Does the word Fenian have a meaning in the Irish language?
No, it was purely the Fenian, yes, came from the Fenia, Fionn McCool's band of warriors. So it was a corruption, a kind of Americanization of the word Fenia, which was the Fionn McCool's band of warriors in the Irish folklore. And again, John O'Mahony was an Irish scholar, and it was John O'Mahony who came up with the name Fenian.
Thank you. So,
fascinating presentation, thank you very much. My grandmother was Kathleen Hayes, or Kathleen Collins Hayes, and her mother was a McCarthy. And her mother told her that 2 of her brothers had been deported as Fenians to Australia. We're not sure when. One of them died on the way, and the other was murdered in Australia. But my uncle was telling me about it last night, and he asked me to ask you, is there a list of anywhere?
There is a list of all the Fenians who were deported, yes, actually. If you come up to me afterwards and talk nicely to me, I might look it up for you. I have it here. I have actually a list, if anyone is interested in names, of anyone who was arrested under the Habeas Corpus Act or any other Fenian activities, pretty much in County Cork, I have that list, and that's the only list we have of Fenians, because obviously they didn't keep who had joined the Fenians, so it's very difficult. You have lots of people saying my great grandfather was a Fenian. We have no way of knowing. But
how many were deported?
69, if off the top of my head, and about 15, 16 of those were from Cork.
Yeah.
So we look if the name is there.
Yeah, great.
So,
Is the political party Sinn Féin a direct descendant of this or not?
Oh, that's a very complex question. Sinn Féin, I suppose, came originally from Arthur Griffith, and he wasn't initially an IRB man. Sinn Féin then was kind of, again, it was a name that the British put on and the activity in 1916, mistakenly thinking it was Sinn Féin had organised it when it was really the IRB and the Fenians had done it. So then kind of the both movements came together. But I suppose the initial set-up of Sinn Féin would not have been an IRB initiative. Later on, Sinn Féin and IRB and those who were involved in 1916 kind of did merge into one organisation, but initially, no.
we're officially in the lunch hour now, but one more question.
All right. I wondered, was there any good evidence against Father Collins?
I could give a full talk on Father Collins and the Carry On. It's fascinating.
What do you think?
Eventually, he came out and said that he was. One of the problems was that he was quite a young man. He had, strangely enough, he had helped O'Donovan Rossa. He had been curate in Cape Clear at the time that O'Donovan Rossa was a relieving officer there, and they had worked hand in glove together. So.
So he was a different Father Collins. He wasn't the Father Collins who gave the testimony.
No, he was a different man.
I thought he was the same.
And that mistake was made in some of the newspapers at the time. One of the newspapers actually reported, this man who had gone to London and done so much, but actually it was a totally different Father Collins.
I made the same mistake. Yeah.
He was, this man was a much younger man. He had not been long a parish priest. An older, wiser man probably would have dealt with it far better than he did.
No, I couldn't imagine that the
Yeah.
original Father Collins.
No,
would have done it.
he was long dead at that stage. He didn't deal with it very well. He said nothing, which kind of fanned the flames. And eventually he did come out with a statement denying anything. It was partly the reason why they suspected him was the Sunday before the arrest he had gone on the pulpit and given a fierce denunciation of Fenianism from the pulpit. And then within days the right person was arrested, and people put two together and came up with burning it with an effigy. Yes.
Okay, well, this is wonderful.
What was the angle of the church so in condemning the Fenianism? Was it a directive from up higher or just the priests were? I know they're educated in Maynooth. Was it founded in Maynooth? Was it
1795 at this time. Yeah.
Would it be direct, or would it be their own personal politics?
It was a mixture of both, Donnacha. Certainly the hierarchy, Cardinal Cullen, Bishop Moriarty, Bishop O'Hay here were dead down in Fenianism. It went against their worldview at the time. Like they were things that we take for granted, like universal suffrage and republic, were condemned by the church at the time. And they were also very much against secret oath-bound societies, not just the Fenians, the Masonic Lodge, anything like that you're a secret oath-bound society, the church condemned. But there was also local priests, like Father Dorr, like Father Sheen in Bantry, like Father O'Leary in Union Hall. And looking at what they said, I think they were motivated more by the concern for their parishioners. Like Dorr said, if you go ahead with this, you will be trampled down. And I think he feared the violence and the repression that would come. And again, remember 1798 was still very much in people's minds at the time. And there was a time when the government suppressed, brutally suppressed in this area, a rebellion that never happened here. But there were much floggings and beatings and hangings. And that was in the back. Certainly Father Dore, who had been parish priest since 1806, he was a very old man. So he would have kind of said, oh no, we don't want this, out of concern for his parishioners as much as any dictate from on high. So it was a mixture of both.
Okay, I think we'll have to draw it to a close. Wonderful morning, I think, don't you agree? Two really good speakers. Thank you, Pat. Thank you, William. Plenty more to come this afternoon.